students in Beijing. Will the demands for democracy topple the Chinese leadership? The Journal with Barbara Fromm and Paul Griffin.
Good evening. Another startling day in Beijing. The protests that many thought would have died down by now have grown instead to massive proportions. No longer just students. People from all walks of life, even some soldiers, are joining the call for democratic reforms. And the protests that have engulfed the capital are now sweeping the country.
At the center of it all, 3,000 hunger-striking students camped out in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. There's activity in the square night and day. Weak hunger strikers taken away by ambulance, demonstrators shouting slogans, and more than 1 million supporters crowding the sidelines. In a moment, we'll get a first-hand account of these historic protests. But first, a look at some of the dramatic events of the last 24 hours.
What we demand is this. The government has to admit that this demonstration is a patriotic demonstration.
I think those students should be takes water. Right. Yeah, this is very important for maintaining the life.
How far will the students go? They'll struggle to death, I think.
If I were in the government, I would be very, very worried.
No one can defeat people. It's not the people will win.
In Beijing, Catherine Sampson from the Times of London. She has followed the recent events and spent much of the day talking with protesters in the square. Catherine, what do you think we're looking at here?
Well, I think for the first time in 4 weeks of student unrest, people are actually starting to talk in terms of revolution. Today was completely different. It was a sea change in events from over the last few weeks. It's gone beyond a student movement now. I think the students may even have lost control of what's going on. We had people from ministries coming out with banners today. We had soldiers coming out with banners. We had people from the Trust and Investment Corporation. You name it, they were there today. And the other thing is that they were calling for the overthrow of Deng Xiaoping, who is China's senior leader and who was credited with starting China's economic reforms 10 years ago. Now people call him a dictator. They say he's too old to rule the country and that he's corrupt.
Why do people feel so emboldened? Is it the sheer numbers, the sheer variety of people coming into the streets, or something else?
Well, I think they've all been moved originally by the fact that the hunger strikers are actually talking in terms of martyrdom. And that has really moved people very deeply. They're very angered by the fact that they think their government is doing nothing to help these people who are almost starving to death in front of them. So there's that anger and that emotion. There's also the fact that I think there were between 1 and 2 million people marching today. There's safety in numbers. Before, workers were always afraid of being fired. When there are that many people out on the streets, it's very difficult to know how on earth you can punish them. And how do you start punishing your people in your ministries and your big corporations, the people you really need? So from that point of view, they've found safety in numbers. They've also found unity with the students in calls against corruption.
The options out of this seem increasingly narrow, don't they?
Well, they do. The government doesn't seem to be making any very clear option. They don't obviously want to make a violent crackdown while Gorbachev is in town. But even when he goes, it's going to be very difficult. There are so many people on the streets that it's really going to be a matter of tear gas and bullets to stop people. That will cause a huge loss of face to China, a huge loss of international prestige. This is Peking. It's not in Tibet, where there aren't too many foreign journalists around to see. That is a really dangerous option. But if, on the other hand, they announce political reform, that is a very bold step. And there are lots of people in the leadership who are so conservative that they will resist that as long as they possibly can. I imagine that there are huge rows going on in the leadership at the moment about what should be done. And that is probably why there is no very clear initiative on the part of the government. No one, I imagine, has the upper hand at the moment. And it's only when we begin to see how the demonstrations are being handled that we'll know who stays on top and who, I think, probably will leave government.
The military that we've seen sitting in the square and somehow creating a buffer, what's been their attitude? At the beginning, there seemed to be friendly exchanges of cigarettes, a kind of jocular atmosphere. Has that remained?
Yeah, there has been surprisingly little military presence. I actually saw several trucks, well, between 10 and 20 trucks of soldiers in the back streets behind Tiananmen Square this morning. But other than the few lines of troops around the Great Hall of the People, there were very few in evidence, even fewer than in the early days when they used to cordon off the roads. They've given up doing that now. I think it's because they see that when there is a direct confrontation with police or troops, people get even more excited, and it's the sort of situation which could even lead to a riot.
Catherine, tell us the kinds of things people are saying. Are they aware that something significant has shifted?
I think they are. My feeling when I saw what was going on today was that it had for the first time taken on a revolutionary nature. And I didn't want to say that without checking it out with people. And so I asked a lot of people, and they said, yes, you're right, that is what's happening. If you press them on the points of, well, do you want a multi-party system, they tend to back off a bit. They say that's not in keeping with the Constitution. They're not quite clear where they're going, but certainly they realize that they want to get rid of Deng Xiaoping, and he is really the image, the symbol of Communist Party power here. Zhao Ziyang yesterday made a very unusual, really, statement to Gorbachev, saying that a decision had been made the year before last that every important decision would be referred to Deng Xiaoping. So in just yesterday, it was made very clear that Deng Xiaoping is the only man who counts. Today, they were saying on the square, Deng Xiaoping, go home to Sichuan, save the country by leaving us alone. Deng Xiaoping, stand down. We want the people to become the masters of the country. They were extremely outspoken.
Very quickly to wrap up, Catherine, is there a sense of their own anger rising? Anybody articulating anger?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think the students are angry about their own concerns about dialogue and about the hunger strikers, but I think it was a festival air in general in Peking today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The size and the intensity of the Beijing protest has taken Western observers by surprise. Diplomats are now urgently reassessing the stability of China's leadership. Zbigniew Brzezinski was National Security Advisor to U.S. President Carter and has just written a new book on modern communism. Dr. Brzezinski, do you think we are watching history being made?
Very much so. What the students in China are demonstrating for is, in fact, a democratic revolution against Marxism-Leninism. This is part of a larger sweep of events, which is not just confined to China, but it is momentous in its implications insofar as China itself is concerned.
Do you think these students, and now joined, it looks like, by a much wider segment of the population, do you think what they're doing is unstoppable?
In the long run, yes. I think it is conceivable that at this stage there may be some accommodation between the students and the government, some concessions to the students, and essentially retaining the status quo. But in the longer run, it is quite clear that the non-communist revolution is undermining communism throughout the communist world, and very much so in China. In China, economic change has moved a lot forward, but there has been relatively little political change. And the students are now demanding that this gap be closed.
From your knowledge of the players on the scene right now in Beijing, what options have they got?
I recently wrote a book called The Grand Failure, in which I recount at some length an extraordinary conversation I had with a Chinese leader in whose name the students are currently demonstrating, Hu Yaobang. At that time, he was the designated successor to Deng Xiaoping. And in the course of a 5-hour conversation, he outlined a revolutionary program for political reforms of China. This seems to me, and incidentally, he is now dead, this seems to me to be a sign that there must be other Chinese leaders who recognize that China is in need of very massive political overhaul.
Dr. Brzezinski, the placards in the street and the banners are saying down with Deng. They want to get rid of Deng. From your knowledge of the Chinese system and the current players, do you think they've got options here?
I don't think they have the option of overthrowing Deng, although Deng himself is close to retirement. The problem is whether the team that Deng has designated as his successors, the leader of the party, Zhao Ziyang, or the Prime Minister, Li Peng, can work together and provide some continuity. My guess is that we're moving into a phase of political instability in China, something which is not unusual. In the past, students have been the catalyst of change, of political change in China, and it appears that we're now entering one of those phases.
There were fears at the beginning of the week that as soon as Gorbachev was gone, they'd bring out the army. Do you think that's still possible?
It is possible, but I think the leadership would like to avoid bloodshed. And if that were to happen, there would be bloodshed, because the students are now in a very emotional, very, very high-strung phase.
Do you think they will capitulate to the students? Do you think anything significant can break here? Some people think they're feeling a revolution in the air in Peking right now.
That is correct, and I think that there is a kind of a revolutionary momentum developing. My guess is that the government will try to accommodate partially in order to diffuse this. I would also hazard the guess that at this stage, the overthrow of the regime is unlikely, but it is part of a larger historical process, which in fact is sweeping away communism as we have known it.
Why do you say immediate overthrow unlikely?
Because I would think that the government still has enough repressive institutions which could protect it if push came to shove, but then there would be bloodshed. My guess is that both sides at this stage would prefer to avoid massive bloodshed.
Is there a figure on the scene that somehow could express all these aspirations?
I really couldn't answer you with any sense of confidence. Hu Yaobang clearly was, and it was his death that precipitated these demonstrations. There might well be within the leadership some members of the Politburo, some of the younger ones, who are sympathetic to the students and who could emerge as a kind of reform, liberal-type leader, providing direction to the revolutionary changes that are now very much demanded and probably very much needed.
When you look at the sum of the changes demanded, if they were all implemented, what would it mean to the communist system in China?
I can answer that very briefly. It would mean its end.
Do you think that system can accommodate these demands?
At this stage, I don't think that system's prepared to dismantle itself. This is why I was saying that I think more likely is some partial accommodation, some use of pressure to maintain the existing system. In that context, further reforms in the hope of diluting and dismantling the opposition. But in the longer run, I think we really are witnesses to something of momentous historical importance. The end of Marxism-Leninism in its Chinese, or for that matter, Soviet or the East European varieties.
Dr. Brzezinski, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
The Beijing protests come at a time of major economic change. In a moment, a documentary report on everyday life in China and how even government reforms have sowed the seeds of unrest. That story when we return.
Today's anti-government protests are the biggest since Mao Zedong's communist revolution 4 decades ago. A lot has changed in that time. Mao's successors rejected his doctrinaire vision of communism. They have replaced it with a distinctive mixed society that has socialist and capitalist elements.
But for the protesters, the changes aren't happening quickly enough. And they say there are serious flaws in the changes that have already been made. The BBC's Gavin Essler has this report on the roots of China's discontent.
Born in Peking, the ancient capital of a young state. In the 40th year of communist rule in the People's Republic of China, the daily patriotic ritual unfolds at the heart of a nation facing a crisis of political confidence. What should China do next? The crowds gather early in Tiananmen Square. Well away from the demonstrating students, Chinese tourists queue at the tomb of Chairman Mao Zedong. Yet now Mao's old-fashioned certainties have been rejected by the students, by the sightseers, and even by the most senior leaders of the party he brought to power. Chairman Mao had a clear vision of the world, a constant struggle between socialism and capitalism. Today's leaders of the Chinese Communist Party believe that vision was responsible for keeping the country poor and backward economically, and politically for pushing it to the verge of chaos during the Cultural Revolution. The new leaders have abandoned the old dogmas and replaced them with what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics. Yet in the past year, even these new pragmatic policies have run into acute difficulty. The new slogan, socialism with Chinese characteristics, is difficult to take at face value. It can look exactly like capitalism run by the Communist Party. In the new private enterprise shops, the drabness of Mao's China has gone, replaced by all the signs of a Western consumer society. Freedom of choice, to be rich now acceptable, though the party keeps the political power. But in this brave new hybrid world, somewhere between capitalism and communism, China now struggles with inflation, panic buying, corruption, and simple greed. The end, prosperity, apparently requires suffering the side effects of unpleasant economic means. The man in the Chinese street knows all about living with the daily pain of reform. Xini Yang, now in his 70s, is a leading Peking intellectual. Like all city dwellers, he's seen the great optimism of the 1984 reforms eaten up by 30% inflation, signs of political panic at the top of the government, and a new austerity program intensified from last month. Xini is well off by Chinese standards, working with his English-born wife Gladys as a translator. The Yangs are deeply committed to the idea of reform, but dismayed by the distortions it's produced.
I really don't see that people's resentment are very much connected with the reform. They are worrying about prices going up and inflation and so on, and that's mainly caused by government corruption and also by a lot of people making money.
We have rather high salaries by Chinese standards, so we're not feeling short of money, but certain of our colleagues are, and a number of them are taking extra work outside to get enough to live on. But I think government is also partly to blame for rousing people's expectations, encouraging consumerism before the country was rich enough to handle the situation.
Everywhere you hear the same complaints. We love reform, loathe its problems. The key, China's leaders say, is price reform, ending state subsidies for basic goods, allowing them to find their real free market value. The catch, as customers in Peking's night market know to their cost, is that when the Communist Party steps back, the invisible hand of the free market pushes prices one way, up.
People are quite disturbed by the uprising price. Since 1985, the price is going on, you know, in some other words, the skyrocketing, you know.
The price has gone up 20 to 30% since last year. Why do you think it's so bad? I don't know why. It just seems to me the trend in Chinese society for everything to keep going up and up.
This year is certainly dearer than last year. All prices have gone up. The price of meat, the price of all foods has increased. But people still come to the market to eat. It's a kind of tradition.
The crunch came last August. The new free market and more money in people's pockets created a sudden boom in high-cost consumer goods: bicycles, refrigerators, washing machines. Peking's main department store, a cross between Harrods and Selfridges, had queues of customers at the door every morning, desperate to buy anything available, fearful that the prices would go up. Sales almost doubled in a month. A whole week's quota of washing machines went in an hour. With the same story of panic buying across the nation, the government was shocked and slammed the brakes on the free market. Gao Shangguan is a senior Chinese official charged with implementing the economic reforms.
Last year, the price reforms in China led to panic buying. The panic happened simply because people weren't able to understand what the reasons were for having price reform. They thought it meant that all prices would just start to shoot up uncontrollably. They were very frightened that costs would rise so much that they could not afford to buy things if they waited. The government recognized that a panic like that was an extremely important signal, and that we therefore have to slow down price reform until people are properly prepared for it and understand its consequences.
That openness about China's difficulties from the very top has begun to trickle through the political system. For the first time in 40 years of communist rule, newspapers are telling people the bad news about the economy and debating the best solutions. China Daily, an English-language paper much read by outward-looking Chinese, gives some idea of the changes. Full reports on student demonstrations are still taboo, but unlike in Chairman Mao's time, crime, corruption, natural disasters are now reported. If it is not a fully free press, it is at least preparing China's people for the problems ahead. But on China's fast-changing streets, the leaders have one overwhelming fear. What if the radical students demanding democracy were to link up with the discontented ordinary workers hurt by the price rises? It could even sweep the Communist Party from power. Socialism with Chinese characteristics now means China has two utterly contradictory systems, a free market and a communist-planned economy operating side by side. Unbelievably, that results in two prices for the same goods, a low state price, a high free market price. China's nation of shopkeepers took 5 minutes to work out that if you buy low at the state price and sell high, you make a fortune. It's called corruption.
Corruption is so widespread. It's not only limited to a few high-up officials, but it is down to the ordinary rank and file and so on. There are very few people who are not involved with some of that. Yes.
Certainly the party seems to be giving a lead in corrupt practices. I'm not saying all party members, but enough for there to be great resentment against them. And the image of the party is tarnished, and party members are not seen as public servants so much as people who want to get on themselves.
China's leaders know that widespread resentment over corruption could destroy the Communist Party unless they restore their moral authority. But the overall leader, Deng Xiaoping, is in his 80s and restricts himself now largely to ceremonial functions. He's barely in control of the great economic forces his reforms have unleashed. The struggle to succeed him may well be between those like General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, who want to speed up the reforms, and conservatives like Premier Li Peng, who want more central control from the party. Whoever wins the battle for China's future, for veterans like the Yangs, the consolation is that today's problems are at least part of a total rejection of past mistakes.
You can look on the present confusion and chaos as growing pains, inevitable in this process. And if you compare China with other third world countries, this country has done remarkably well, I think.
The last 10 years is a period when we try to change from our past mistakes. I think we are making progress in the last 10 years. Only the progress isn't as great as it was made out to be. Yes.
China's ancient culture somehow survives it all. Even Chairman Mao could not kill traditional operas, though he tried to replace them with musical propaganda. He could not kill the business sense of his people either, and despite the new social strains, it is helping many of them prosper. One import from the West, Marxism, is now apparently less in fashion, and another, consumerism, is in. But the result has been widespread impatience from students, intellectuals, and workers that change is coming too slowly. As Chairman Mao turns in his grave at the spectacle, the new banner, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, has a suspicious ring. Could it be just an empty slogan the leaders repeat while they work out what on earth they should do next?
To Chinese citizens currently living outside their country. Anshan Li is a history student doing his PhD at the University of Toronto. Lei Ming Chen teaches Mandarin at a community college in Vancouver. Both were involved in student demonstrations when they lived in China. Mr. Chen, do you think these students are going about making their demands in the proper way?
It has to be a kind of process. I mean, takes a lot of time and patience. But what they are doing is good. You know, encourage the government to do something to reform, to change its face.
Mr. Li, did you think they'd have this much success, that we'd be talking tonight about a mass movement?
For success, we have to see, it depends on from which perspective you're looking at. For me, I have already seen success for this movement. The government have made several concessions, which was unimaginable before. And also the TV and newspapers covered the stories of what was going on in Tiananmen Square, and this was a big victory for the students already. But for the future, or for that's another. I mean, that's another story, and that depends on how government will respond, or how sincere the attitude would be towards the student movement.
Mr. Chen, Gorbachev now moves on to Shanghai, the area where you come from.
Yes.
Are students as militant there? Is the town as radical as Beijing, perhaps? Can they keep the momentum?
This morning I saw a lot of students has been on the street. About a couple thousand students went on a hunger strike now. So it's I'm positive.
So this thing's growing?
Yes.
How do you think the leadership's going to respond, Mr. Chen? Are you afraid for some of these students?
Of course, you know, everybody who attends this kind of activity has to, you know, they have some kind of risk. But it seems they don't care. And I wouldn't care if I were there.
You wouldn't?
No.
Why? What would you think?
From you know, you can say from Chinese history, all the changes in China mostly brought by students. So in this sense, students' movement can change the society. So if you can do these kind of things, why should one be afraid?
Mr. Li, what about you? If you were there, would you be worried right now?
I would say I worry the students' health now. But if I were there, definitely I would be one of them. And in January 1987, that's also another big student demonstration, and I was working in Beijing at that time, and I was in Tiananmen Square. And this kind of, you know, the sense of responsibility and the face sometimes can make people, you know, they can defy everything.
Gentlemen, it's very good of you to be with us. Thank you very much.
Strikers. Mixed reaction. A general strike called for Panama is a fizzle to some, successful to others. And what's good for the environment also proves to be good for business.
The CTV National News with Lloyd Robertson.
Good evening. Just when it seems events in China couldn't get any more dramatic, something even more amazing takes place. It's as if the protest in Tiananmen Square has taken on a life of its own, and nothing can stop the passion it has engendered. More people from more places, even soldiers, are now adding their voices to the cries for reform. And all this totally disrupting Mikhail Gorbachev's visit. Jim Munson reports.
They came from every walk of life and every corner of China. Hundreds of thousands, peasants, factory workers, and even government employees. All were on their way to Tiananmen Square, the symbolic heart of the country. It was a common cause now. Under the umbrella of the students' pro-democracy movement, they voiced their frustration over rising prices, poor salaries, and corruption in the Communist Party. If there is one target, it is China's senior leader Deng Xiaoping, many predicting his demise and the present communist regime. For the 3,000 hunger strikers, it has been 6 days without food. Hundreds have fainted. Ambulances raced to the city's hospitals. In a significant gesture, Premier Li Peng and Communist Party General Secretary Zhao Jiang went to see the ailing students in hospital. The biggest fear for the government now is if one should die, the movement will have a martyr. This massive protest has overshadowed the Sino-Soviet summit and upset Soviet leader Gorbachev's hectic schedule. Cancelled his visit to the Forbidden City. Instead, a longer walk on the Great Wall. He was about as far away from the protest any visiting dignitary could be. Even his news conference was moved from the Great Hall of the People to the government's guest house. After a 2-hour delay, it was Gorbachev, the diplomat, who was fending off questions about the crisis in China.
I wouldn't take it upon myself to be the judge. And I wouldn't take it upon myself to perform the mission of assessing what is happening here today.
He acknowledged receiving a letter from China's student protesters, describing it as a very warm letter full of feelings of support for perestroika, Gorbachev's own reform program. As he spoke, the sea of demonstrators spilled over from Tiananmen Square. It seemed everyone wanted to be part of this protest for human rights. Some soldiers were quite willing to join the students in the greatest challenge to 40 years of one-party communist rule. The students and workers have now focused their attack on China's senior leader Deng Xiaoping. Many see the aging politician as a leader who has outlived his usefulness. There is a common belief that the old economic reformer is only blocking the road to greater political freedom in China. Jim Munson, CTV News, Beijing.
The demonstrators in Tiananmen Square are not alone in calling for Deng to step down. Some high-ranking Chinese officials would like to see that too. But as Jim Laurie of ABC News reports, getting rid of him will not be easy.
For 3 nights, as the demonstrations grew, China's top leaders have been meeting to try to solve the crisis. At first, they considered demands that they meet publicly with students to negotiate democratic reforms. But as demands for the retirement of Deng Xiaoping increased, they were faced with a more difficult problem. Chinese sources say the 5 men who form the top Communist Party decision-making body are divided. There is Zhao Jiang, Party General Secretary, who observed the demonstrations from afar. He is seen as a moderate in favor of political reform, in favor also of retirement for Deng Xiaoping. And opposing him is Li Peng, the premier, a conservative who students say lacks credibility. That Deng is now the target stems from his refusal to accept political reform and his denunciation of students as minority troublemakers. But Deng is not a man to be easily discarded. The architect of China's bold and successful economic reforms, he's been a successful political infighter for 60 years. More moderate voices, though, express the hope that Deng can retire soon, but quietly.
Stop for those who have collapsed in Tiananmen Square.
About 30 hunger strikers have arrived here at the medical center so far today, every one of them encouraged on by the crowd.
The crowd cheers, one doctor said, because through the strike, the students are putting their lives on the line to send a message for everyone else. And so there were cheers as well for the workers from the Beijing oxygen factory for their donation of oxygen. cheers for the union leader for his donation of money. And for the medical workers for their donation of medical supplies.
In that way, I felt I was giving them a helping hand, too.
Jane Bell, a Red Cross volunteer who's been working inside for the last 4 days, says the students can use all of it.
Once you lose a lot of your body fluids, you become disoriented and your mind stops, your brain stops slowing down and functioning, and then a lot of them go unconscious. And so by giving them fluids back up and IVs, then they're bringing the kids back and giving them the strength that they need to function for the body fluids.
You know, people have said here are students who are willing to die for democracy. You're a health professional. Is that too melodramatic?
No, I don't really think it's melodramatic at all. In fact, we have to really talk to the kids, even after we get IVs started, to get them to drink. I tend to be able to talk them into it, tell them that their mother would want them to drink. Some of the parents have tried to talk their kids to stop, and they don't want to. You know, they believe in what they're doing.
This is for our country, he says. Our country's future, our country's hope.
The doctors here say that many of the hunger strikers have been in for medical treatment 3 and 4 times, and after they're treated, they insist on going back down to the square.
The students are very determined. If the government and leaders will not solve this problem, I don't think the people will end these things, will end this movement. They are very determined.
He's my boyfriend.
Her boyfriend has had nothing to eat or drink for 6 days. He's having heart problems now, but she says she completely supports his hunger strike.
Will you go back to the square? Will you go back? You will? How do you feel about that as a doctor?
Some of the patients should go home and rest. But if they're determined, if they insist, we respect their wishes. But if this goes on, they will be in danger. And so the ambulances make their deliveries, the doctors pile in for another pickup, and the crowds cheer. The young, who don't really understand what this is all about, and the old, who do. Talk to me about the hunger strike, she says, and the tears roll down my cheeks.
Live back at Tiananmen Square, another river of people just flowed past here shouting, "Li Peng must go." The government and the Communist Party find themselves under increasing siege, and China's own journalists are getting a taste of the free press as our special live edition of 48 Hours continues. 48 Hours from China. It's worth noting that the Chinese version of a generation gap is at work here. The young, the students, are pushing the reluctant leadership into change and maybe right out of office. The traditional Chinese reverence for the elders is taking a back seat to the demands of the moment. Top leader Deng Xiaoping is 84, and one sign this week here in Tiananmen Square read, and I quote, "When people get past the age of 80, they get muddle-headed."
Zhongnan High. To the Chinese, this is their White House, their Kremlin, the high-walled compound where all the top leaders work and live with their families. Today, the rebellion spread to the very gates of power, the headquarters of the government and the Communist Party.
It's unbelievable.
I walked there with Asian scholar Stephen Goldstein.
What we're seeing now in front of us are truckload after truckload of workers going by expressing their support for the students.
Now we see the headquarters of the rulers under siege. This is as if demonstrators could control access to the White House.
It's as if students of Washington demonstrated and then said that we are going to take responsibility for protecting the White House.
Normally, Chinese pedestrians are not permitted to linger in front of the gate to Zhongnan High. Today, a half-dozen weakening hunger strikers lie on the pavement.
and there's nothing the guards can do about it.
Do we call this anarchy, what's going on all around us?
It is not anarchy in the sense that order doesn't exist, but the students are maintaining the order.
Behind this ornate gate, the communist leaders of China have ruled like the emperors in the ancient Forbidden City, governing in secrecy, remote from the people.
They're saying to the regime, you want democracy? You talk about democracy? Here it is. Now what are you going to do about it?
And you talk about People's Republic of China, we're going to take it.
We're the people. You talk about political reform, we've got it.
Is this spreading so that they are going to control all of Beijing, the capital of a country of 1.1 billion people?
They are certainly, as you say, beginning to control the major centers, the major political nerve centers of this city.
Steve, when do we then stop using the word demonstration and start saying revolution?
I really don't know. Revolution occurs not only when there's a popular discontent, but when leaders cease to respond.
Deng Xiaoping, the protesters chant, it is time to leave the stage. The 84-year-old Deng changed China, opened his nation to the world, and created economic reforms with a touch of capitalism that are far ahead of the Soviet Union. But now the patriarch has lost his charisma.
Whatever solution they find, or whatever develops out of this, I'm beginning to feel that this will permanently change the most populous country in the world.
I think you're right. I think that what we've seen the last few days is a genuine historic event.
Good evening. In the news tonight, Premier Li Peng calls for...
News workers said Mao must serve the people. But since Mao came to this land, the tightly controlled media served the government that controlled it. Example, 2 weeks ago, Chinese television showed the swearing-in of young communists at Tiananmen Square. There was not a word about a major student demonstration in the same place later that day. Not a word, not a picture. But this week, reporters find their stories leading the newscasts.
We are started telling truth right now, at least from yesterday.
So at Chinese television, reporters and camera crews hurrying to cover the biggest story of their lives now believe they will be able to tell that story the way they see it. The censor who once came daily from the Ministry of Culture isn't showing up anymore. For 27-year-old reporter Fei Cha, freedom of the press, a major demand of the students, has come at breathtaking speed.
Why? These people are here, they say, for one thing, for freedom of the press. Why? What is it that they want?
Well, they just want newspaper and television and radio to say something true.
And with this newfound courage to speak out has come credibility for reporters like Wang.
How did it feel before, when you couldn't tell the truth as a journalist?
They hate us. They hate us.
And now?
We can interview what we want, and also we can say, we can report what we want.
Today, the story was hunger striking students. That is, if the students would allow the government journalist into their area. The decision, they were welcome. Wang had his story for the nightly English language newscast. His executive editor, who must approve the script, is also a party member.
You better use some of the shots from...
You saw that?
Yeah.
She's crying like crazy. Then he has a stand-up of him saying this is the lane where the ambulances come, and just a very quick thing.
Very good.
The stamp of approval, the script virtually unchanged.
CCTV's Chuan was at the Tiananmen Square this afternoon and has this report.
Well, that is the so-called emergency line.
To those who have tasted freedom, it will be hard if they are ordered to give it up, to go back to the old ways, even if that means the rules that were in effect just last week. And there is no guarantee it will not end as quickly as it began.
China, things happens in China. I think it's like Shakespeare's drama. The curtain never falls. You've got to wait and see.
Well, live from Tiananmen Square, and the thought that people power is playing to an ever wider audience in the People's Republic. Bruce Morton reports from inside China's largest city when we return, so stay with us. Chinese government television just released pictures of this morning's extraordinary visit to this square by the premier of the country, Li Peng, and the Communist Party leader, Zhao Ziyang. Now, according to the government account of the visit back there with the hunger strikers, the Communist Party leader told the hunger strikers, "We came too late, we should have come before." And he promised them that if they would end their strike, the government would not end its dialogue with them. As previously reported, the early indications are the hunger strikers are saying that's not enough and they aren't buying the whole thing. Tiananmen Square, 100 acres here, the largest public square in the world. And just this week, it was filled to overflow with more than 1 million people. That's a population as large as the state of Maine. The square is surrounded by memorials to the Chinese Revolution, to the people. This People's Revolution may have begun here, but it is not ending here. And among the places caught up in the fervor now is the largest city in the country, Shanghai.
Visiting the hunger strikers is not always easy. You have to come through the crowd of spectators and friends first. They're friendly, but the big crowd can shove a camera crew around. This is how one of our arrivals looked. Once you're in, though, the students show a lot of discipline. Linked hands sometimes for crowd control, ropes sometimes, and when that isn't enough, they yell at the standees. This chant goes, "Sit down." Lots do, and that makes getting around some easier. Chinese demonstrators, it turns out, like to chant. Her chants say, "Long live students, long live the people," and to love the country is not wrong. Trying for more power, she's pointing one megaphone into another. The movement needs bigger bullhorns. This was our first visit Wednesday afternoon. The crowds kept growing.
It's just after 10:30 at night, Wednesday night, Shanghai time. We passed about 4 groups of students going home on our way back to the municipal building here. But as you can see, there are plenty left in place. There are more spectators, there are more hunger strikers than when we were here this afternoon. And their mood, as you can hear, is anything but gloomy.
They applaud, this is Thursday morning now, whenever a new group marches in, but this applause was for us, for the CBS News camera crew. The students believe very strongly that a free press in China and abroad will help their cause. They devoured the newspapers that were passed out this morning. All right, one kid did have what looked like a girly book, and whether they're right or wrong about press coverage, there were a lot more reporters and cameras there today.
And I think the people in China are all supporting the students here.
You meet people at these demonstrations. We met Xiao Li, third-year international relations student. His parents and grandparents live in America. He chose to live here.
Well, I think I should stay here because I'm a Chinese. I love China.
Coming here was not without risk.
Many students are threatened that if they come to the Bund to go on hunger strike, and then they won't have good job after graduation. I think what they want is very reasonable, and what they are thinking is just what I am thinking. So I think it's up to me to come here.
He says, "I admire Gandhi in India for his nonviolence movement, and I think what we can do here is just go on a hunger strike."
Because, you know, we worked for quite a long time. From the Main Force movement in 1919 to 1989, we have waited for almost 70 years. We just want science. We want democracy. We want freedom.
They do not all want elections now. They want the government and the party to speak to them and their concerns.
Not to overthrow the government, but to make the government pay attention?
Yes, because I don't think that there's another party or political group.
How serious are they? The young man being talked to is Sun Jiangyu from the Shanghai Electric Power Institute. The older people are from his school. They're trying to talk him into quitting the hunger strike and going back to school. He said no. They offered him what looked like vitamins and water. He said no. Sun did have to leave later, though. The medics said so, and they're medical students, not authority figures from the adult world. Sun argued with them, too, but he lost. When he left, the crowd applauded him. They really are disciplined. Medics, caretaken not to disturb the few police they face. They're sophisticated in some ways, naive in others. They hope to win. They do not all think they will. He says China has lost so many chances in the past, we don't think we should lose more chances.
All day, more and more groups, more and more banners have come marching down the Bund. Shanghai Television, the Journalists Union, the Drama Group, a Christian Institute. The students have started something, started a movement here in Shanghai, and it's hard to imagine it ending anytime soon. The sign says, "Mama, we did it for your sake." Mama in this Chinese phrase can mean either mother or country. They are patriots. But Xiao Li thinks he may go to America after all.
China's cry for freedom and democracy is also being heard in the United States. This is San Francisco. Students delivering a letter to the Chinese consulate, urging the leadership in Beijing to heed the will of the people. A similar letter is delivered in New York.
We are a group of students from Columbia University.
My name is Yuan Jiang. I am from Beijing.
I'm from Sichuan province.
I'm from Beijing.
I come from Wuhan.
There are more than 25,000 Chinese students studying in the United States. For these Columbia University graduate students, their link with colleagues at more than 50 other American campuses is both the telephone and the computer.
We are now in a most critical moment for China's future.
And of course, television.
Is the CBS Evening News. Chinese sources tell us that the Army has told the government it will not act against the demonstrators unless it's called to put down violent riots.
As you saw all of these demonstrators today, more than 1 million in the square, what thoughts went through your mind?
Well, I wish I were there, but I'm here.
Here you are, we're on Broadway here in New York. You are touching and feeling this thing called democracy and freedom, something that the students in Tiananmen Square in Beijing are willing to put their lives on the line for, to go up against the Chinese government. Do you think it's worth it?
I think it is quite worth it for Chinese students sometimes to take a radical action or sacrifice their life in order to obtain freedom and democracy.
31-year-old Chung Yu wants to be involved in the action. A graduate student at the University of Chicago. She is expecting her first child in November. But this morning, her mind was on the crisis back home.
I think it has a lot of historical significance, and also emotionally, I'm so moved by the students. So I want to be part of it.
Chung Yu is on her way to Beijing now to add one more voice to the 1 million plus already there.
With us here in Tiananmen Square, and we're honored to have her here, is Betty Bao Lord, author, authority on Chinese history and lore, and wife of the former ambassador of the United States to China. Betty, what does this tremendous concern for the hunger strikers tell us about China? And do you know anybody out here?
Yes, I do. As a matter of fact, I know one of the young students who are in one of those buses who has been on a hunger strike for the last 4 days and on a water strike for 1 day. His parents are very proud of him, and they have stood by him. In fact, they've made the ultimate sacrifice. They don't go to see him because it would be too emotional, and they're afraid that he would break down. And so at one end of this square are the parents praying for him, and in one of those buses, their child.
This is the traditional, deep Chinese concern for children.
Yes.
What's the most important thing for Americans to know about these extraordinary events this week?
I think it's because this square is where the Communist Party and the Peasant Revolution came in to take the capital. And at that time, people welcomed them. People felt this was their leader. These are the leaders who could speak for him. I think what we see today are people who feel they can speak for themselves. And this is a big change. Perhaps not because the party has made them all into a jail, put them in a jail, but they psychologically, in many ways, have put themselves into a jail. They have felt they have to look to somebody to speak for them. And I think they have found out today they can speak very well for themselves. Also, the second point is there's an old Chinese traditional saying that says one Chinese can carry a pail of water, 2 Chinese can only carry a half bucket of water, and 3 Chinese can't carry a drop of water. And what we're seeing today are strangers working together, caring for one another, and doing something together without having been told by somebody else to do it.
Betty Bell Lord, thank you very much. Now, when we come back, we'll be looking at a lot of things, including the latest from the square. But before we do that, let's note that there's been a kind of stunned silence from Washington during this week of remarkable change in China. And with me now to talk about that, the Soviet-Chinese summit and what's happening here, are 2 of our experienced correspondents in Washington, Leslie Stahl, our White House correspondent, and Bill Plant, our State Department correspondent. Leslie Stahl, George Bush is the only American president ever to have lived in China and one of the few to know very much about the Far East at all. Any indication of what he may think about all of this?
Well, Dan, the White House has been, as you pointed out, virtually silent on this whole issue. I will tell you, though, that privately, the White House is extremely grateful that it was Gorbachev and not George Bush who was there during this demonstration. This would have been extremely difficult for this man to have handled. After all, how could the leader of the free world not walk out among those students? They're quoting Lincoln, they're fighting, they're dying, some of them obviously, for freedom and democracy. And yet, as a diplomat in China, George Bush was, it would have been extremely difficult for him to have crossed his old friend Deng Xiaoping and to have done that. So they're very grateful that it's Gorbachev who was embarrassed and not George Bush.
Dan?
And Bill Plant, was our State Department caught completely off guard by all of this?
Dan, I have to tell you that the first reaction we hear from all of official Washington is that they are very glad that for once it's Gorbachev who's being upstaged instead of George Bush. They are delighted that Gorbachev had to change his schedule, had to be taken in the back way, that he got very little international media coverage. But on an official level, Dan, they take a rather ho-hum and nonchalant attitude toward this. They maintain that it doesn't really affect U.S. interests, although there are some conservative voices warning that it may very well if the 2 communist giants drop the tensions between them.
Bill Plant and Leslie Stahl, thank you very much. Charles Kuralt has been with us here watching the student rebellion become a mass movement, occasion and historic occasion. This time I have a feeling we may actually be right about that.
I can't think of any parallel experience. I can't think of any parallel in human history, to tell you the truth, Dan. A genuine uprising from the people, not orchestrated from on high. It has been a very moving experience to see. We're used to big crowds. We're used to focusing on demonstrations and having to tell people, well, other parts of the city are calm. No part of this city, and today, no part of China is calm. People are in a patriotic fervor, and patriotic is what they think this is.
And it has a spontaneity and authenticity that is unique. It occurred to me that so often our cameras are accused, and rightly so, of distorting an event, making it seem larger than it really is. This time, it seems to me that our cameras are not large enough to take in the scope and importance of this.
The Chinese don't know where this is all going. The people, all these millions don't know. The people in the government buildings don't know, and we don't know. I am sure, however, that we're going to be telling our grandchildren that we were in China this week.
It's an unsettling time. I don't find myself afraid of anything, and the Chinese don't seem to be afraid, but there is that sense of they're plunging into the unknown.
They know what they want. They want something like the First Amendment, freedom of speech, the press, freedom of assembly. They want an end to corruption, by which, in talking to many of these people, I have come to understand as an end to what they call the back door, the necessity to have a connection, pull, to get anything done. They know that some people get good apartments. They know that some people can change their jobs, but they know they can't. And millions of people all over China are saying, that's wrong. You shouldn't have to have a back door. You shouldn't have to have government corruption. In a country as great as China, they always had that.
And these hunger strikers, the hardcore back there in the square, they said time and time again, listen, the party elite and their families get special treatment, and we're through with that.
Communist Party members are saying the same thing. Workers are saying the same thing. Yesterday, you remember an event like this in little moments. Yesterday, a great truck full of workers and leading a convoy of other such trucks came down just one of the streets miles from here in the suburbs. And people lined the streets cheering, and the banner across the front of the lead truck said, addressing itself to the hunger strikers, "Hang on, little brothers, your big brothers are here now." Something about this kind of experience sends a chill down your spine, doesn't it?
It sure does. Thanks, Charles.